variables or factors that influence how people view the police. We know that there can be situations where people will not have contact with the police. As I mentioned on the well, actually right up on top there, it's about 20, I think it's about 20 or 21%, according to the data set, that out of all the people who were included in the data set that actually reported having contact with the police. So approximately 1 out of every 5 people. So the question that I think researchers want to look at is, how do all of the other people who've never had contact with the police create their perception? Well, there's vicarious situations that can be measured, experience that they hear from friends, family, or peers about their interactions, positive or negative with the police. That's another area of research that's being delved into as well by social scientists. And so I'm talking about citizens' perceptions of the police and the factors that influence it, because when it comes to citizens' perceptions of use of force, many of those same variables or factors that are used in the general perceptions research can be found in the use of force research as well. There's a lot of overlap. Now, some of the social costs that I think are, well, you can quantify some of it because there's fear of crime research, of course, and fear-based research. But there's other things like measuring the mistrust that results from the mistrust of citizens toward the police that results after a use of force incident occurs. That's really difficult to be able to quantify in some cases. You can do it, but there's people who would argue that they would argue the accuracy of that. Other things that happen when use of force occurs is that people can become fearful of the police and want to avoid them, not report victimization. And then ultimately, there are individuals who do not want to cooperate with the police. They want no interaction because they're fearful and mistrustful. So when we're looking at how these kinds of outcomes that are obviously negative, it's really tough to fix that. And so one use of force incident, so despite the fact that, you know, it's a somewhat rare event in some places, it has long lasting, very detrimental effects that are not easily fixed. Now, citizen complaints, liability claims, and lawsuits filed against the police, that section would be the data that's used when we're looking at the financial costs. Now, the citizen complaints actually can sometimes be connected to the liability claims. Generally, when people begin to complain about use of force being used against them, it'll start in the form of a complaint, a citizen complaint, if they have that option. And if they're not satisfied with the outcome of the citizen complaint, then they'll usually bump it up to something more severe, such as a lawsuit, or else they'll have some kind of a liability claim against the department. So I use that type of data to look at the financial costs. So the reason that I'm mentioning this before we really get into some of the things that Dr. Cooley mentioned is because I think it's important to have a context when we're talking about use of force and to know that the outcomes, some are very easily quantifiable, looking at financial costs, and others are not as quantifiable, but they're just as important. In some cases, some would argue more important. Okay, so Dr. Cooley had asked in an email, you know, how does the United States compare to other places when it comes to the use of force? And one of the things that I did was I did a search to look to see if there's any comparative research on this. And there have been a couple of groups who have put some data together. One of those groups is the Campaign Zero. They're known for creating the Mapping the Police Violence Tracker. What's interesting about the United States is that only recently in the last few years has the government begun to actually try to collect use of force data directly from police departments. Now, the sad part about this is the first year of collection, because this is a voluntary process, many police departments did not provide the data. So we're not really any further along knowing about use of force frequency than we were before. The second year that the government collected the data, I think there was a 1% increase, went up to 41%, I believe. Still more than half of those police agencies did not report. And so with the government starting to collect use of force data just in recent years, that's one source that we can use, but it's incomplete. Other groups, the Washington Post, they also have a great database that looks at use of force. And that's based upon kind of a mixture of things, but mostly information that can be found in the media. But Campaign Zero, they are very similar. This group looks at reports based upon media accounts. And so this was probably the most recent one that I could find that would allow me to do a comparative look to see how we compare with other countries. So what you see there, and again, because we've got other places, it's either data from 2019 or any of the other most recent data that was available to this group. And so you'll see here that clearly the United States has a greater frequency of use of force compared to all of these other places, even Canada, which is probably one of the closer places to us. And so when you look at these numbers and you ask yourself, why is there such a difference? That is the million-dollar question. When you read some of the researchers' potential explanations for this, you have everything that runs the gamut from the availability of guns in the United States compared to some of the other places, of course. You also have some people saying that the structure of the criminal justice system in general, but policing system overall, also makes a difference. What I mean by that is the United States can best be described as a quilt of different types of, or patchwork of different types of police agencies. For example, there's about 17,500 police departments, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. All of those departments have sort of their own thing going on, right? They get to decide what kinds of policies they create. They get to decide to an extent, depending upon what is required by the state, what kind of training is available to police departments. My point of telling you this is that every agency is doing something a little bit different. And so when you've got this fragmented system of police departments in a country, it's really, really difficult to be able to have any level of control over what's happening, unless you pass, of course, federal level laws, right? And so when you look at that compared to some of the other places, you know that the cultures within the countries are also different. Just the perspective of community is different in some places. There's more of a collective perspective. For example, in Japan, definitely a different type of culture and thinking about what's best for the collective good. That's very different here in the United States. So to answer your question, Dr. Cooley, this is some recent data that I was able to run across that was collected by Campaign Zero. So you can see that there's definitely a difference between the United States and many other countries. I did look for some other countries that were, what did you say, less industrialized? Right. Is that what you use? Okay. And I couldn't really find much. And part of the reason for that, as I did some reading, is because many of those countries do not keep records at all. In fact, it's not something that they're concerned with at all. And so this was the best I could do for you, but I think it definitely demonstrates that there is a significant difference with the United States and other places. So kind of switching gears a little bit, I mentioned to you that I was going to talk a little bit about use of force in a different way. And I wanted to look at financial costs. I think Dr. Powell did a great job talking about some of the social costs of use of force last time. And so just to kind of give you an idea of the financial costs, you can see here that just this very quick Google search, it demonstrates that use of force is definitely something that is of high financial cost, not just to police departments, but also to taxpayers. And I think that it's really important to point out that these are just individual cases that just happen to pop up. Some of them are more, have received more media attention than others, but this is just sort of a list that I comprised within a few minutes. Just to give you an example of the number of costs. When I teach the Intro to Policing class, oftentimes when we start talking about use of force and the costs associated with it, it's always interesting to watch my students' faces every semester when I put a slide like this up, because I don't think that people think beyond what they're hearing about the shooting. If it's a shooting-based use of force incident or an asphyxiation case in some instances. But when you look at the actual costs, it's staggering. There's a lot of money that goes out with regard to this use of force. And again, these are incidents that are fewer in frequency, but they cost both socially, as Dr. Powell talked about last time, and in this case, as I'm focusing on, financially. And so when I was looking at studying the financial costs, and really as a PhD student, I was thinking about, I read all this literature on litigation involving the police, and a lot of the litigation had to do with use of force, ranging from non-lethal, of course, all the way through deadly force. And when we look at that body of literature, I was not only just shocked by the dollar amounts that they were talking about, but I was also shocked that I didn't really read anything about solutions or prevention. And that was where I came up with this idea of, what are they doing? The question I wanted to answer is, what do police departments do to try to prevent or reduce use of force? And that's what led me into discussions with my mentor, Sam Walker, talking about how police departments, just sort of anecdotally that he's done research at, what do they do? And that was a very short discussion because he simply said they don't do much. And I wanted to find that out. That's why we do research. So what I did is I wanted to find out what police departments do. I decided when I was creating my methodology for my study, I wanted to look at the largest police departments out there that had 200 or more sworn officers, to see if they had anything that they did that was related to reduction or prevention of use of force. And so I chose to go with the largest police departments because they have the greatest level of interaction just by sheer numbers of being in large cities. And that's why I focused on them. But I started, there were 354 on the list that I had that had 200 or more sworn officers. So I turned into sort of a telemarketer. I got on the phone and I literally spent 6 months calling every single department on that list. Oftentimes I would have people hang up on me. There's a person in Boston Police Department that dropped an F-bomb. It didn't deter me though, because Boston Police Department is a big department. So there were many other people I could call. So I did. And I ended up getting every single police department to respond to my questions, which was, that in itself was amazing because I was asking them, what do you do to deal with lawsuits? Which is not a question they want to answer. But what's interesting is after asking all of these agencies about litigation and about how they prevent or reduce or what do they do, what I found is that approximately 4% of the largest agencies, that's it, only 4% actually do something to try to reduce or prevent use of force in the future. So what I wanted to do after that first step of being a telemarketer on the phone, I guess I call it phone interviews, right? I identified the agencies that the 4%, I sent them more in-depth surveys asking more about risk management and legal advising. And so I was able to get, I think it was about 75% of the agencies returned the surveys. And this will tell you how old I am. They faxed their surveys back to me. Yes, which was, it's kind of funny now looking back on it. But I was able to sort of further hone in on some of the things that these agencies were doing regarding risk management. And then the final phase of my study was to actually go and do week-long site visits to the agencies that were using risk management and legal advising in a way that was according to them, I didn't do an assessment, but according to their evaluation, was making a difference. And so I ended up going to 3 different places. And ultimately, I got a small grant when I was an assistant professor at Marquette University the year after I left UNO, Nebraska, Omaha. And they gave me a grant to go to Las Vegas because, believe it or not, Las Vegas was actually doing really interesting work regarding use of force and risk management. So I got a grant to go to Vegas. You don't hear that very often. So I did all of this. And what I learned about the use of risk management was kind of interesting. All of those agencies used some elements, one or more elements of risk management to identify actions, and many of those actions had to do with use of force. They did things where they would analyze whatever data they had. And again, these are individuals who are working in the department. These are not social scientists or people who have statistical backgrounds, but they would basically look at the previous 10 years of data and try to figure out what actions were causing or leading to the most payouts. And so, as you can imagine, and I guess I hypothesized this from the very beginning because it's kind of common sense, but the more serious the use of force, the higher the payout, right? But what's interesting is there were some departments that had a lot of more frequent, less serious use of forces, such as handcuffing, using stern words. Believe it or not, there were payouts resulting from that because they will file a lawsuit or some kind of a liability claim. And what I learned is that the police department realized it's cheaper to settle outside of court than it is to actually bring it to court. So their goal was to reduce and prevent use of force by looking at what actions resulted in that outcome and try to make changes. Now, I want to give you a quick example. There was one individual, it was in the state of Tennessee. When I was talking with him about changes they had made to training policy procedures, he mentioned that they had a problem with what he called hog tying. That was just the phrase they used. And that would be when they're trying to subdue an individual, put them in the back of the patrol car, they would take their hands behind their back, handcuff them, but then they would also bind the feet together and then lay the individual on the back seat face down to transport them to wherever they were going. And in a few instances, people died from asphyxiation or other issues. And so he said, we decided after that, although hog tying only resulted in death a few times, we decided that we were going to ban the use of hog tying. And so you're probably sitting there thinking, well, this is common sense, you know, this is what they should be doing. And I agree with you, but there's many police departments that are not doing any of this. And so that, to me, that's the kind of non-finding was actually a really big finding. The fact that there's so many agencies doing absolutely nothing. That was a big deal. I also learned, and this is something that can be a little shocking to people, but another way that they tried to prevent or reduce costs associated with use of force or other incidents that can be categorized as critical incidents is that they would have a rollout team. And the rollout team consisted in some cases of one or more people who would be called to the scene of a situation involving the police that is very likely to result in litigation, okay? And what they would do is they show up on the scene and not use of deadly force, of course, I want to be clear about that. They would show up on the scene and they would talk with the individual who was the victim of the situation and basically ask them, you know, we can offer you X amount of money today if you sign this paper agreeing to not sue the city, okay? And they felt that this was a good way of reducing the costs because, as I mentioned before, it's much more expensive to go to court, right? I'll give you an example of a case. Now, this is a more minor use of force if you're looking at the use of force scale, but the situation itself would have been very costly to the police department. So I was interviewing the person who is the part of the roll-up crew in one agency. He said that they were going to serve a high-risk warrant, and it was in the middle of the night. They had their warrant, everything was spelled out legally, what they could look at, all of that. They served the warrant on this apartment. It was an apartment in a low-income area. Unfortunately, what happened, they bust through the doors, middle of the night. They grabbed the woman who was there. She was sleeping without any clothing on, and they made her lay face down on the floor. Didn't let her cover up or anything. And they also woke her children up that were in the other rooms and made them lay face down on the floor. And as you can imagine, this is very shocking and traumatic, right? Terrible. To make matters worse, after all of this was executed, somebody realized that they served the warrant on the wrong apartment. So they call in the rollout crew, right? The guy with the checkbook, and he showed up. And remember, this is in a low income area. So this is where, when he was describing the process to me, I started to feel a little bit uneasy. He said that he offered the mother, after they allowed her to finally get dressed, they offered her $2,500 if she'd sign a sheet not agreeing to not sue the city. And she did, because $2,500 is a ton of money, right? And so she took that offer and they avoided going to court. Now, I want to ask you, if you were somebody who was serving on a jury and you had this case in front of you, would you, as a jury member, would you agree to a settlement amount or a payout amount that was higher than $2,500? My guess is yes, it would have been much more costly. But the bottom line is, so the financial part, I get it, I get that. But I kept thinking about what are the social costs of this? The children who are there and frightened, and the mother who is there and frightened. Again, it goes back to this issue of looking at both the costs or this action from two different perspectives. So that's another way that they would try to reduce the likelihood that they'll have to pay out for something. Now, some of you may think, well, we're talking about use of force here. Well, they used force to get into the apartment and to throw the woman to the floor. So there was an element of force there. It wasn't deadly force, but nonetheless, the situation alone was traumatic. So what they ended up doing is I said, well, how does this relate to risk management? How do you prevent this? I guess you just simply read more closely. And he said, no, what we do is we actually have two people now that will read the address instead of just one person looking at it. And you may be thinking, well, that doesn't seem like a radical change, but that's what risk management is making people stop and take a look at what they're doing before they do it, before a mistake is potentially made. I'll give you an example of medical field. If you've ever had a surgery before on a knee, has anybody ever had the X? You know, they'll put the X on your knee. They do that not just to be funny, but they do that because they want to remind the surgeon, who's probably had several other surgeries prior to your surgery, maybe hasn't had a lot of sleep. They want to remind that surgeon that that's the knee, right? You don't want to do an operation on a knee that's good. That's risk management, something simple. Make a change in process, in procedure to try to prevent a negative outcome. So that's what I really learned with regard to the use of force, ranging from breaking into someone's apartment and throwing them to the ground, all the way through the use of deadly force, but the person didn't die. That's a whole nother body of research that people haven't really looked at as closely, not as closely as they should. But ultimately, what I learned is that these agencies that were making the changes to try to prevent these things, whether it be for the good of the community or for the good of finances, and you can kind of decide for yourself which is more important to each agency. We don't know, every agency is different, but they decided to make changes to the PTSR, the policies, training, supervision, and review, meaning that they have someone monitoring or auditing behavior. So just to give you an idea, of course, we know based on the research, if you look at research dating back to the 70s, that the more restrictive use of force policies are, you'll see a decrease in the use of force overall. That's not just for deadly force, but it's also for non-lethal things, such as the use of tasers and OC spray. So we've got a lot of literature that shows that policies can make a difference. The kicker here is the policies have to have teeth. They have to have some consequence. You can have a policy, but if it's not enforced, it's not going to work or make a difference. Training. Today, we have de-escalation. And I know Dr. Powell talked about that a little bit last week. Instead of just going hands-on with people, officers are trained to use their communication skills to de-escalate a situation before use of force has to be used. And then, of course, social interaction training, which I believe that there could be more of that done in the academy in most places, because it varies wildly across the country. But that's something that I think is very critical when it comes to interacting with people. Supervision, that would be supervisors in the form of a human, a supervisor, he or she out on the street, or virtual. That would be early intervention systems that I mentioned to you before, because those early intervention systems are meant to supervise and watch over people. And then, of course, the reviewing aspect would be making sure that somebody's watching this behavior. One thing I want to mention, because I am focusing on prevention, is that some police departments, not all, but some police departments now are moving to where they're creating civilian-based positions to actually help with the monitoring and the review of officer behavior. Here's an example. There's a police department, I'm trying to remember which one it is, but it's not like a big one that you would think of, like one of the big five. It was actually more like a medium sized, but they actually created a position where they bring in an individual and this person's job is to sit and review body cam footage all day long. And you can imagine, you know, the driving around that the officers do, even just talking with people at the park, if they get out and talk with people. You review the body cam footage for every shift, for every officer, every day, for every month, for every year. That's your job. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that seems a little boring. But the point of this is that you have another set of eyes looking and monitoring at what the behaviors are. And if something has been picked up in the monitoring of the body cam footage that didn't result in a lawsuit or a citizen complaint, it's one way to catch it that otherwise would not have been caught. Now, the idea and the way that this will prevent use of force is that if an officer is using behavior, specifically words, and this is something we were talking about before the panel begins, if they're using words that are kind of charging the situation up that could ultimately lead to a use of force of some sort, that's not good. And if people do not catch that and intervene, it could continue and ultimately end up in a use of force situation. So this monitoring behavior by a civilian in this case, some police departments are taking this very seriously. I wish more were, if I'm being honest with you, but this is something that's fairly new that police departments are trying to do to reduce and prevent use of force incidents. Does this make sense? So yeah, when I'm focusing on prevention, I kind of want to look at, you know, what are the police doing? What are some of the financial costs? These are things that Dr. Powell didn't cover. You covered very nicely the social costs. Okay, and some of these things were covered last time. Court case outcomes, and again, anything that you can do to restrict police officer discretion, especially when we're looking in the terms of policy, that's very, very helpful. There's research that supports the more restrictive those policies, the less likely that behavior, use of force is going to occur. Also, certain court case outcomes. I believe that this is one of the things you talked about last time, Dr. Powell, looking at changes at the federal level that'll trickle down. Tennessee v. Garner, looking at the use of the fleeing felon doctrine, it overturned it. You can't just shoot people when they're running away from you. Prior to this time, you could. But after the research that shows after 1985, the Tennessee v. Garner decision, you began to see a huge decline in the use of force cases, especially people when it's a fleeing situation. Something else that's going on today, there was a little bit of a lull, maybe in the last maybe 5 to 7 years, but there's federal level interventions being done by the Department of Justice and the COPS office in Washington, D.C. And basically what happens is if there are departments that are having shootings at a frequency that is getting the attention of the media and maybe politicians and community members, the Department of Justice can go in either voluntarily or involuntarily and do an assessment to see what's going on in that department, and then ultimately make changes to reduce that behavior. So the consent decrees, these would be situations where the department isn't inviting in an assessment. The DOJ is going in and they're going to do an assessment. It's going to be legally, it's going to be part of a legal process. And whatever the assessment shows, that if their actions are kind of a pattern practice that is not legal or that goes against their training and their policies, they're going to identify this in the evaluation, and by law, they're going to record them to make changes. That's what the consent decrees are. Now, collaborative reform initiative, this is voluntary. This is where you can have a situation where a shooting occurs or a series of shootings, and maybe the chief of police realizes that changes need to be made. And so he or she, the chief of police, can invite the DOJ in and ask them, please do an assessment and give us some recommendations for change, right? Now, this was something that I was part of in Milwaukee. Dr. Cooley mentioned that. And my job was to help them with the assessment. And so my part of that was to analyze 3 years of traffic stops to see if there were racial differences. And of course there were. I also was responsible for analyzing and identifying any differences racially for the stop and frisks, right? They call them pedestrian stops, but essentially they're stop and frisks. And then I also had to assess their early intervention system, which not a shock, it didn't work. It was a terrible system. So there's definitely other things that are out there that are external from the police department that can also have an effect or a change. Now, not all consent decrees end up in a positive way. Some departments that go under consent decree, they'll make the changes, but if there's a change in a chief of police, they can revert back when that chief leaves. Now, finally, this last one's kind of interesting, and this is fairly new. Insurance companies have become a pretty big player in making changes, or player in police reform in general. Now, when I read the first article on this, which was written in a law review journal, the attorney was talking about how there are insurance companies who they cover police departments. And if they see that the police department has a patterned behavior, such as use of force, that leads to liability, ultimately some kind of a large monetary payout. And then of course, there's social costs that go along with it. There are insurance companies that will step in and say, if you don't make changes to your use of force policy or your practice, we're going to drop your coverage. And that is a big deal, because if the police department doesn't have coverage by the insurance company, that means they're on the hook for the payout, the money. And they have to get that from somewhere. So insurance companies, shockingly, have kind of become this player in police reform when it comes to using approaches to reducing or preventing use of force. And to do that, they have to make alterations to training policy. So my concluding remarks would be, we know out of those 17,451 agencies, that there are some police departments that are trying to reduce or prevent use of force incidents by making changes. The bottom line is, though, we still have work to do, a lot of work. And this is tough because we have a fragmented system that I mentioned before. Some people have argued that we need to have more of a national approach to making changes instead of this piecemeal approach that we've been using. And I completely agree with that. But this last point is one that I want to make, and that I think is so important. If we want agencies to make changes that will actually result in or prevent use of force, they need to be making decisions based on data or evidence-based practices. And in order to do that, as academics, we need to help them. We need to look at the data, help them understand what's going on, make suggestions to make changes to reduce this particular behavior and ultimate bad outcome, and hope that they actually do this. But I also believe too that there are some academics who are very quick to complain and to pick apart what the police do. And it's easy to do when we see them doing something they shouldn't be. I understand that. In fact, a lot of the research I conduct is being very critical of actions of the police. But I think that what's important is that because we have the skills to do the analysis using data, it's our responsibility to help them. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for them to make meaningful changes or long-lasting changes.
Thank you.
Sure.
And it depends on how you would like to do this. Would you like to take
Questions, or would you like to start off by
each other first?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts, but I don't want to just to guide discussion. To me, the most cogent and telling portion of the presentation is on risk management, and that original research is really important, and I'm glad that you're continuing with it. I don't want to dismantle any part of the presentation, but one thing that I do want to talk about is the way that we present numbers to each other. And we present numbers to each other in social science a lot the way that the stakeholders are also presenting the numbers. And so the Bureau of Justice Statistics tells us that in only 2% of all of these interactions will force be used, and then in a smaller percentage of that is the force even inappropriate. And this is a comment I always feel like I need to make when that 2% figure is rolled out. I talk about that 2% figure myself. One is that there's a point at which someone has to make the report, and that person has to decide whether or not there was a threat or there was force being used. That kind of data is very different, for instance, from, say, if we have a citizen-held camera pointed at a police officer, and then we can review that again and again. Body camera footage is really good data, but we also have to remember that it's a lot closer to the police perspective than it is to the citizen perspective. So I would say that we want to look at as much of that kind of data as we can. But we also want to think in terms of how the number is presented, which tends to minimize force even in the United States. And what I was really happy about was when you showed the comparative statistic, because if we're talking about in the last 10 years, anywhere between 50 and 65 million police contacts across the 750,000 officers in the 18,000 police departments, you can say 2%, and that means that in over 1 million cases that police were using force. And that's the 1 million cases that we know about. So what I appreciated about your presentation of numbers was not only that you showed the comparison, but also that you showed what kind of monetary costs that taxpayers are dealing with. Over this last decade, cities have paid over $1 billion out in police misconduct settlements that we know about. And so when I'm looking at your discussion of risk management and the critical response teams, the rollout teams who are taking a tip from corporate products liability attorneys who will go and intimidate people into taking a very small settlement very early on and signing a number of documents which will inhibit their ability to press for a greater civil liability in the future. I think that kind of research is really important, in part because it also helps it helps police officers to just continue with what they're doing, because now there's someone at the systemic level who's reducing the liabilities that they actually cared about in the first place, which are the monetary liabilities. But those were just a couple of my stray thoughts in during the presentation.
So I have a question for you, because you mentioned about how the 2%, that you have an issue with that, and I understand the issues for sure. But my question to you is, what else do we use then? What other data do we use?
Oh, well, one of the reasons that I think that we need to look at every record we can find of actual ongoing interaction between police and citizens is so that we can expand the notion of force. And I know that I know you agree with me on that.
But where do we get that from? What does that look like?
Oh, well, okay. For example, I think that people are unlikely to report at any level that a police officer casually puts their hand on a sidearm and leaves it there. I mean, I wonder, how do you report that as threatening, for example?
That's my point. My point is, we're in a situation where we're studying a topic where it's very difficult, as I described. The government only recently began to use of force data, and it hasn't really come to fruition at all, and not even close to anything usable. But then the next question is, where do we go from there? Because if we're just going to complain about the data, I think it's really important to look at, well, what else can we look at and analyze to go beyond just that 2%, the data that's provided by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So that's why I'm wondering, what does it look like? What does that data look like?
And my response in general is that the 2% figure is often trotted out by police advocates, union presidents, and so on to minimize the problem. And that's and like I said, I didn't want to dismantle the presentation. I just wanted to mention that there are different ways to consider the number.
Yep, I get that. I guess my thought, though, because I thought long and hard about it from a methodologist standpoint, I'm somebody who's definitely a data nerd, and I love looking at different methodologies and different data sources. So I thought about that. But I guess when we're looking at the data that we have to go by, if there's nothing else to look at, I don't know how we can jump to conclusions. And the phrase jump to conclusions is accurate, because if we don't have any other data to use, how do you come up with any kind of meaningful result or idea? Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
So I wasn't really trotting out the 2% like the police
Right.
union, some police unions would. But it was more like, this is what we have. So if this is all we have, my next question is, well, if we want other data, then what does that look like?
Well, and that's why I appreciated the comparison to other nations. I think too that we really do need to be concerned about how we have a crystallized rhetoric now around use of force, and that we tend to adopt the language that is provided to us by the stakeholders. And so use of force is a clinical and sanitary term for what is often a violent encounter between police officers and citizens, something that Dr. Cooley mentioned the last time we met. And it's one of the reasons that I tend to adopt a more phenomenological stance on police and citizen interaction, is that people are experiencing force at the moment that they encounter a police officer, and that there are a lot of reminders along the way that violence could be in the offing.
Sure.
And so if we trim use of force down to there are a number of incidents and it either happened or it didn't, I think that we're doing a disservice to our own ability to analyze. By the way, that this criticism is really oblique. It's not aimed directly.
No, I didn't do the research, but what I'm also thinking too is, when we're talking about like using the data in a way to where you're minimizing it, it's not necessarily that, it's more of a contextual issue. But I also think too, that when we're looking at use of force and we're looking at how it's defined, every agency, as I mentioned, has a different idea about what, some do not track that. But as I mentioned in the presentation, there are departments such as the Dallas Police Department that is now starting to collect data every time an officer takes his or her gun out of their holster. So it's going beyond, did this happen or not? They're starting to use body cam footage in ways to where they're trying to look for the actions leading up to, which is what you're talking about. So I think that the methodology is finally starting to move beyond, is there force or not? And partially that's because of that technology that they're starting to use.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we're on opposite sides of the fence on this. I just think that we can both acknowledge that there's methodological issues here.
And I think that you're correct to go right to the decentralization and fragmentation of American policing. When we look at 2% across millions of incidents in the United States, of course, it seems like a monolithic presentation, or that all the police are doing things the same way. When we know that force in Williston, North Dakota was, well, as you have said it, is different today from the way it was 20 years ago, but is different, very different from Newark, New Jersey, even today. And of course, we know that within 100 miles of the southern border, brown-skinned people are getting stopped more than once this year, right? Getting stopped 2 or 3 times this year. And in that momentary encounter are being traumatized again, but now in a new and different way, because they realize they have a legitimate beef. I'm being stopped because I look as if I don't belong here from the point of view of a police officer. And so I think that my starting point is always going to be, well, let's make sure that we understand that the numbers are not representative of human experience here. The numbers are representative of events.
Of course, yeah.
Now, do you want to turn it to the audience for questions, or do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, the audience, they're the ones who sat here this entire time and came. They should be able to talk. They should be able to ask questions.
Well, I'm going to ask a question to start off.
I'll grab that up and phone your question. Are we not working? It should be, but
Yeah, we won't.
just to be safe.
So I thank both of you for those comments. But I'll add this, when I was listening to it, I also worry about numbers because they either do too much or they do too little. It's very rarely a Goldilocks moment where they're just right. But I was thinking, is it a difference? Part of this, should we be going back to how people have their psychological frameworks, how they understand these issues? So a person who looks at justice more as restorative justice is going to be vastly different in their reactions than one who's looking at retributive justice and so on. And so is that maybe a way of, we're talking about preventative, figuring that out, what kind of person are you, and then linking that to the risk assessment. These are more likely to do this, these are more likely to do this, and then look at those for weaknesses or strengths. So you're actually using the surveys that you can do.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, that you bring this up. When I was in grad school, I was working on a project, the main project I worked on during those years, where we looked at the use of mediation between police and citizens who had a negative interaction that resulted in a citizen complaint. And so the use of mediation, well, mediation is basically when you have a neutral third party who comes in and sits down with the other two parties who had a conflict. And in this case of our study, we had officers and citizens. And so my job as a grad student was to go in to these different places. I think we had 12 different locations. We had a DOJ-based grant, COPS office grant, to go in and do interviews with officers and citizens who were part of the mediation process. So what's interesting, Dennis, is that a lot of the people, when we would interview the citizens who filed the complaint, they weren't looking ahead for like a lawsuit or something like that. They simply just wanted to be heard. And they wanted to understand why that interaction occurred the way that it did. They literally just wanted to tell the officer, this is how it made me feel. Why did you do this? They wanted to have an understanding. And it wasn't necessarily about, pointing fingers and chewing out. It was more about, I don't understand why this happened. How did we get here? Now, when we interviewed the other party, there were many officers who said, this is fine. This was actually better than what I thought it was going to be. But then there were some that just refused to be part of that process. So I agree with you. I think that there are people who look at those interactions in a very different way than others, because there are a lot of other people who, instead of choosing mediation, they went right for the citizen complaint. And then if that didn't work out, they went on to the next step, which was litigation. So it's kind of related to what you're talking about. There's research that shows people want to be heard, especially if it's a negative interaction that they don't understand why it happened.
And there are some things that police departments right now across the nation could do, very simple things that would cost them nothing, that would make significant and measurable reductions in citizen complaints against the police. All of the research that I've seen on the ways in which police use language show that people who hear police officers using profanity perceive the encounter as more forceful than they do when police officers say exactly the same things but don't use profanity. And I think part of that too is that profanity doesn't just indicate some kind of violent intention or implicit threat, but also profanity is dismissive. And one of the number one complaint, well, as a matter of fact, the number one complaint in America today, especially in big city police departments, but all over America, is people complain that the police talk down to them and that they use disrespectful language. As a matter of fact, they complain about that more vociferously, even in instances where there were clear civil rights violations. They can forgive the violation, but what they can't forgive is the dismissive tone and the disrespect and the profanity. all police departments have to do is say, it's off the table now. You don't curse at the public, period. And they would actually reduce the number of complaints. But that's a really important point too, that people are not thinking in terms, even though there has been a substantial amount of money paid out in the last decade, people are not generally looking for some kind of payday.
Yeah, and it's interesting because with the mediation study that I mentioned, we went to Rochester, New York, and they had a new chief that was just put in place. And the first thing that chief of police did is they went through the citizen complaints, which I thought was brilliant because oftentimes that's not the first thing they do. But they looked through the complaints to see, well, what are people upset about? You know, what happened here? And verbal discourtesy was the issue. There were a couple of officers who would curse a lot, and the chief decided at that moment that they were going to increase the training in the academy regarding how you communicate with people. But he went a step further as well, and he changed the policy. So if officers were, they had a complaint and it was found to be, you know, this is what they did, the officers would have consequences. And it wasn't, you know, you get a day off with pay, you know, that's what some of us call vacation, right? Instead, it was something that was more substantial. You will have a letter that will go into your file, which could affect future raises or advancement in the department. It actually was him creating a policy with team that reduced the number of citizen complaints focused on verbal discourtesy. So yeah, that happened when I was doing a study in Rochester.
We have people who would like to ask questions.
I was curious about sort of two things. One is the enforcement of policy. If you make policy changes like that flag system that they had, you know, if that is only enforced by the supervisor and I get 3 flags and I have to talk to my supervisor, you know, how do we kind of see any positive follow through with that or any consequences? And then you also emphasize that national approach to police reform, and I'm wondering if what kind of specifically you see, is there a precedent for the federal government stepping in to make changes?
That's a great question. And, you know, we have things like, I used the example of Tennessee v. Garner. This was a court case outcome, which requires every police department to create a policy that will fulfill what they, you know, what's dictated by that court case outcome. And with research for decades after that, we began to see a huge decline just because of that court case outcome. That would be an example of what I'm talking about at sort of a federal level. Creating some kind of a federal level policy that would require officers to report every single time that they're in a situation and that they use de-escalation, for example, because we're talking about force. And if officers are always thinking about de-escalation, because if they use it, they're going to have to report it, mandatory reporting on sort of a federal level would be great. And there's research to demonstrate that having to report those kinds of things, that, you know, something as simple as, you know, I had this interaction, it got a little hostile. I used, you know, the following phrases to de-escalate the situation, to demonstrate in the form of examples. That's kind of what I was referring to, because right now, especially after George Floyd's death, we did see some police reform, but it was piecemeal across the United States, right? Some departments made some changes. There were some departments that banned chokeholds. There were some that changed the way that they were, you know, able to hold people or not. Police departments have made changes, but it's not enough. And that's why I said we still have a lot of work to do. But the reason I mention this on a national level is because the only way that we can have that significant change all happen at once is if there's some directive or overarching mechanism that's going to force that change. Otherwise, we're going to end up with this patchwork, which is what we have. And that was both before and after George Floyd's death.
Yeah, by 2015, the Seattle Police Department was actually disciplining officers for failure to de-escalate. One of the things that I liked about new police accountability was that you were constantly calling attention to external and organizational pressures that made these kinds of reforms really fragile. And I sent you an email about how I'd kind of like to ask you about the new accountability. You had Tamir Rice on your list, and that's the one that the Tamir Rice case is one that always pops into my head. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was shot by the police while he was playing with an airsoft pistol with his little sister in the park. And there's widespread agreement that among police officers who review the case, including the official reviewers, that this was very poor policing. So one police officer was fired. A 12-year-old boy is dead. One police officer was fired, and the field training officer was initially suspended for 10 days without pay, which was then cut in half in arbitration. He actually took it to arbitration and then was managed to get it cut in half. It seems to me that one of the strongest parts of that entire book was pointing out just how fragile police reform is, and often how temporary police reform is going to be. So what would the federal reform look like that could be more sustainable, do you think?
Well,
I mean, I have to agree with you, a Supreme Court case is lasting, right? No question about that.
in most cases,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, in most cases. Well,
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that it would take something just like that. Because up until this point, we have been using a piecemeal approach. And I do think it is important to point out departments that are trying. They're trying innovative things, right? Because to suggest that nothing's changing and nothing's being done is also not correct. But I think that the only way we're going to see dramatic change, like I think many people wanted to see after George Floyd's death, is to have something that's overarching.
yeah.
And we're still kind of waiting, right? I'm always an optimistic person when it comes to these kind of things, which is, I think you had asked me in the email, do you think it was too optimistic or too positive in the book? And absolutely not, because if we only focus on the fact that these things are still happening and do not try to find solutions, feasible solutions to make changes, then we're not any better than we were before. So the book with Dr. Walker, the New World of Police Accountability, focuses on all the different ways that police departments can use certain approaches to make changes. Now, again, the key thing here is that they have to make the decision to make those changes, to want to, and then to sustain those changes, which that is a big deal. Police unions, as you also mentioned in your email, that is definitely a barrier in some states more than others. Now, North Dakota and Minnesota are two different worlds when it comes to police unions. And we saw kind of a lot of that uncovered after George Floyd's death. I think it was the Tribune, Minneapolis Tribune Star? Is that my?
Oh, yeah,
Newspaper?
it's a St. Paul has a paper and Minneapolis has paper.
Someone did an investigative report that actually looked at how many times officers were rehired after they were fired for very serious situations. And I think the percentage that they threw out in the paper was 50%. And I've seen other investigations where they found something very similar. So, even despite the power of some police unions in some places, I still think that we need to have solutions for officers and police executives in particular to use to try to make change. If we only complain and do not provide these feasible solutions or potential solutions, then we're not going to get anywhere.
I have a quick question. Sort of building on what you guys were just talking about in terms of like, how do we make this change and where does it come from? And it's not going to come from the federal level, right? Unless it comes through a court case, basically, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think at least not anytime too soon. And I know that there's a body of research that I cannot tell you too much about, but I know it exists about innovation and also diffusion of innovation, right? And I recently heard a talk at ASC in Atlanta where they were, it was a public opinion poll, and they were looking at how police executives make decisions about policy based on either public opinion or what their peers are doing. And they're basically only influenced by their peers, according to this project. So I'm sort of curious about, I guess, what the research is about how these kinds of reforms are diffused through police executive friendships. I don't know, is like, how is that going? And is that an avenue to tap for wider spread reform?
It's funny because diffusion of innovation was the theory I used for my dissertation. I'm having flashbacks of that very thick book. Yes, which was useful, right? But sadly, my response is that that body of literature, it's very slow moving. I think it's very important because you're right. Police departments, they are more likely to adopt something, and they found this actually with body cameras. Officers began to see the benefits of body cams when they found out that a friend that they had who works in a neighboring department or another department, they give them an anecdotal situation where it helped the officer. So they were more likely to want to be able to use that technology. And so there is some of it, but it's sort of a budding area and it needs to be developed.
In all of the research and diffusion of innovation, rural sociology, anthropology, we know that innovation diffuses more smoothly and more rapidly depending upon the relationships that people have with the people that they want to adopt the innovation, not whether or not the innovation is actually effective, but whether or not their friends think it is. When I'm on the Minnesota Board of Peace Officer Standards and Training, one of the things you learn very quickly is that police officers are notoriously impatient with academia. They're impatient with education and they're impatient with research until they perceive it to have been transformed into training. They love training. And so if the more often that we can cast things like things which we know actually do reduce instances of force, like procedural justice and implicit bias training, if we call it training, then police departments and officers much more receptive to it. One of the things that we did during my tenure on the Minnesota Board of Post was that we cast a lot of the implicit bias training as training that would help police officers control fear in the same way that Navy SEALs control fear. Then they were eating it up. And the reason that we put it that way was because everyone on that work group who was trying to develop implicit bias in service training, which we knew would be met with resistance across Minnesota, was because police officers in America are almost universally afraid of minority men. And fear is related to the likelihood of use of force. So we said, well, let's do fear training, but let's make sure that it's Navy SEAL training. And it's so far so good.
But in a way, it makes sense to me that it would be more pleasing or easier for them to accept in the form of training.
Yeah.
Because if you've read any academic articles, you will know that even an academic who writes academic articles, you just want to put
Right.
it down, depending upon how that article is written.
And my education is already over because I have my 2-year or my 4-year degree. So I don't need to be educated anymore. Now I need to be trained.
Well, and that's the thing. And it goes back to the last slide that I had, the very last point on the last slide, is that academics, we have a skill set and we can be helpful and provide solutions. But we also have to remember too, that nobody cares about the R-square. Nobody cares about, these statistical analyses and all the things that we tend to get bogged down in and that are described to very dry detail in some journal articles. And so, I understand if I had to take training versus read some of those academic journal articles, I would take training any day over some of those journal articles. And I know I have students in here who have read those journal articles and they know what I'm talking about. When you write for an audience that are other academics, it's a completely different language than it would be for police officers. And expecting them to glean something from it that's written in a technical way, I just don't think that that's gonna happen.
It also sounds like framing is going to be really important. Framing it as a Navy SEALs training
Sure.
relation sort of stokes that perception of themselves as well, that perception of themselves. There.
Is there another? Go ahead.
Sorry. We've been talking a lot about like department level policies being put in place or like federal. Are there any things that are going on, like any motions trying to get passed for statewide action?
Yeah.
That's basically your question.
After George Floyd's death, we began to see, usually it was at the state level. There was a lot though of individual agencies, probably too many at that level, but there were some states, and I'm trying to remember the number of states because I read an article that looked at whether or not accountability has increased since George Floyd's death in 2020. And the person was using examples, or their measure of that was any type of reform that was in the paper or talked about in the media. And I know that there were several states. I don't want to throw out a number and have it be wrong. But if you email me, I will absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and it's not one of those boring academic articles. It's actually a newspaper article. But I do know that on the state level, there were states that made substantial changes, for sure.
One of the changes that I'm feeling really positive and optimistic about is the institution of wellness programs for police officers. And it's when I talk about this stuff all the time, and my activist friends think that I'm way too easy on the police, and the police go into a defensive crouch. And I don't say that because, well, I must be right, because they all hate me. They all have legitimate beefs with me, but I'm always trying to think in terms of the practical outcomes. And yeah, I want police officers to address PTSD and other kinds of problems that are associated with the job, the same way I want every other profession to deal with the problems that are created by their work lives. But the public does better when police officers are well. And so anytime this is usually happening at department levels, and it's expensive. Training is also expensive, but the benefits. One of the things that Dr. Archbold can do is she can show police departments that their risk management is going to improve, and it's actually going to cost them less money in the long run to make these front end investments.
Australia, I have a friend who's a policing scholar there, and she does, Jacqueline Drew. She just got done with a project looking at officer well-being across Australia. And what's interesting is not just focusing on the financial cost, but just the level of positivity that was reported by citizens that interacted with these officers who were receiving the training. This is another instance where, yes, there's a financial cost because it would be cheaper if we're looking at the numbers that I showed, and how much it costs to have this training, but the social costs are, I think, incredibly important, and she demonstrates that in her work. So Australia always seems like they're ahead of us in everything. It's great.
Good presentation. I've got a question in regards to when the DOJ becomes involved in reviewing and assessing department procedure. And I'm wondering, is there data over the last 20 years that shows any increase in local departments doing the reaching out to the DOJ asking for help versus them coming in?
So my response to this has to be sort of put in a way where there's definitely a political element here. So President Obama created the Collaborative Reform Program, right? And the way that he created it was that this group of subject matter experts, they would be welcomed or invited into the department by a chief, and they would do the assessment, and it would be no cost to the department. That started when he created it in 2011. When there was a change in administration after Obama, that particular program changed. The focus of it was very different. It wasn't about making the focus wasn't the same. I'll just leave it there. And so when you look at the number of agencies that were requesting this assessment, collaborative reform, it was much greater after it changed after Obama, because the focus here was more about, what kind of training can we do to improve our service? It had nothing to do with what are the behaviors that are leading to negative outcomes like use of force. Am I making sense here?
Yeah,
Yeah, because I don't want to make anything political, but there was definitely a change. And then now when you see with the change in administration to the current administration, they're going back to the collaborative reform type that Obama introduced. So if you're looking at the number of agencies that welcomed the assessment, it was definitely greater with President Trump, but the focus was different there. It wasn't necessarily focusing on fixing use of force. It was more about crime control. That makes sense.
Yeah, and the sessions and bar departments of justice were entirely reluctant to investigate police departments, and I don't think they imposed any consent decrees during the entire Trump administration. That's zero. They're somewhere between 15 and 20 in operation right now.
Yes. And here's the thing. So I was part of the collaborative reform initiative with Milwaukee PD, right? And this was the form that Obama had created. And so we were finishing up the report, and I took a year-long sabbatical to work on this project. And it was a wonderful professional experience. But when we got done, we had a 250 or 60-page report. And of course, everybody wanted that released in the community and the police department. They wanted it released. But when there was a change in administration, we were told that the report could not be released. And it wasn't released by the DOJ. It was leaked by someone to the local newspaper, but it was not released by the DOJ. And it wasn't just in Milwaukee. There were several other cities. I'm trying to remember which critical incident that received a lot of attention. It was that particular agency as well. There were multiple agencies that were told you cannot release these reports, and they didn't. But in our case, it was leaked by someone to the press. So just to kind of give you an idea, you're right. I mean, it was like the change at the federal level makes a difference regarding who's invited in and what they're looking at, and what the focus of that intervention is.
Okay. And then a question around the mechanics of consent decrees. Did I understand you that when those are made, those are between the DOJ and the department leadership?
Well, the department is a whole.
And what happens when there's a change in leadership within the department?
That the consent decree stays, and they stay until they hit their marks. And the marks being the changes that they have legally agreed to make.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter if there's a change in leadership. That's why consent decrees are viewed to be a little bit more weighty or have more teeth than the collaborative reform, because these are legally bound changes they have to make, and they stay until those changes are made.
Whereas if it's merely collaborative reform, that can come and go.
Yes, and that's kind of what happened with Milwaukee.
Another important thing about this consent decrees is that there's an enormous amount of investigating and reporting that is accomplished before any orders are issued, and those are available to the public. So you get a lot of citizen input and investigation into how people feel about their police departments, and it's really telling. I mean, because the things that they're not going to address in a consent decree are often as important as the things that they are going to address. I think that I don't like to say things like this in general, but I don't care about the Baltimore Police Department. So my opinion is it's just about the worst big city police department in America. And they're over and over and over again in their decrees that people were saying, these are the nasty things the police say to us without even saying hello first. They open with accusations and anger and obscenities. And so it isn't that you can do a whole lot with a consent decree about that, but it kind of reveals that one of the things the Baltimore Police Department needed to do is they needed to stop being jerks.
We're drawing to a close, but I thought I'd just try something that was raised here. The woman who took $2,500 because the police breaking in is wrong thing. What's your opinion about that? If I were a lawyer, I'd be looking at it and say, you just had somebody agree to this who is traumatized. They really didn't have the understanding to be able to do this, especially since you just broke in the door, all of this different stuff. This person was under such duress that this would not be a legitimate. And I'd also be worried this gets in the paper. Most people looking at this would be horrified by what happened. So your 2,500 is a waste compared to how it should be approached. That's I'm not the expert. So what do you two think about that?
Well, as a researcher, and again, I was a grad student, and so I was just kind of getting my research chops, right? Applying everything you learn in the classroom out in the real world. And I was doing that interview over the phone, and I was very glad because we're trained that you're not supposed to have facial reactions or have any reaction to a response when you're doing an interview, because you're not supposed to have judgment. And that's what we really try to do. But I mentioned during the presentation that I had that really uneasy feeling just because of the setting. It was a low income apartment complex. I come from a low income background. And so I'm just thinking, what would I have done if I had no money or little money and I'm living in a low income area and something terrible like that happens to me? But if somebody offers me a check for $2,500, that would be the equivalent of hitting the lottery for me. And so that's why I had the uneasy feeling, is because it felt off to me. So I think that we're kind of saying the same thing, but the thing is, Dennis, when you said any attorney, I agree with you. Any attorney would look at that and be like, let's fight that this is not right. But you have to also have the means to be able to have that kind of an attorney, to hire that person. You also have to have the knowledge to be able to know, how do you go about getting an attorney, or can I get an attorney? You know what I'm saying? It's all those steps before that lead up to it. But I agree with you. I mean, that's something that will stick with me because I did all those interviews, and that one just really sticks in my mind because of the nature of it.
Just to add to that, I mean, it's coercive, and it sort of builds on Joel's point. And I didn't see your last talk, but I saw one a few weeks ago of encounters with police are inherently coercive, right? So this woman had no choice but to take that $2,500, right? I mean, that's sort of where it falls. It's just 100% an abuse of power.
But see, it could be argued the other way, right? That she does have a choice, right? In general, right? And that's where I think my uneasy feeling came from. And when I explain this story to my students, because I tell it in methods class, I tell it in Intro to Policing, because it's relevant usually to what we're talking about. I also mentioned to them too that, if your job is to reduce costs and you're the one that's in charge of the checkbook, you're going out there to do your job, right? And I know, because I can tell by your face that it's like, you're doing your job, but what about everything else? But these individuals are doing their job based upon what their goal is, and the goal is to reduce the money. And so as a researcher, I had to remind myself that there are these social costs that we think about with the woman and her children, what she dealt with. And then there's the money costs. You have to really sort of compartmentalize them.
How can that not be coercive? I mean, you've got a guy with a badge. You're supposed to do what you're told, because that gets you in trouble if you don't. And he's offering you 2 months worth of rent and groceries. do what he's telling them.
I'm not saying it's not coercive, but my job is, as a professor, is to give you all the sides, right? All the sides of the coin, and then you can decide, right? And so in my class, because my students have the exact same reaction, which is why I tell it every semester, because I want to get them thinking about these things. But when you're looking at it just sort of like from the situation, not having the emotions involved, she could not have signed the form and not have taken the check either. So what I'm saying to you is that I had those uneasy feelings, right, that you're feeling right now, okay? But I think that when you're doing the research, you've got to step back and you've got to look at it for, okay, what is this? And I know that that sounds super robotic, but as a researcher, we have to try to stay neutral. And so I'm not saying that, I think that we're on the same page with how we feel about the situation, but I'm putting it out there that technically it could be argued that she could have said no.
You're exactly right. I mean, this is you want to see this in terms of it's like a product and service liability model. And so the representative comes out and actually says, well, here's the $2,500, but you need to understand that you're partly responsible for this too. I mean, they engage, it's not so much coercive as it's deceptive. And there was plenty of business experience behind this before the police ever started doing it. So those methods were already there. And even if it doesn't work every time, it's still more cost effective. I mean, yeah, sure. If I never went to law school, but I know right away that $2,500 is not enforceable. And I would represent, I'd get permission to represent the children is what I would do. They didn't sign away for $2,500. So sure, of course you could do it, but there's lots and lots of strategies for minimizing the possibility that someone's going to take action in the future.
It was tough, I'll be honest with you, because I'm a social scientist. My background, actually, I have my first 2 degrees are in sociology, and a minor in psychology. So it was really tough because when I'm looking at the financial part of it, you had to look at it like it's numbers. But in my head, I kept thinking these are people behind those numbers. And so, I agree with you that feeling, I had the exact same feeling, but as a researcher, you have to go in and try to be as neutral as you absolutely can. Otherwise, you're going to end up with biased research, and that's not good.
Can I ask how often this is happening, and if there's going to be like, I guess, public record of situations like this where people are not basically receiving the actual like education of all of their options, and they're being thrown this money for something that isn't morally equivalent?
Well, I like that, morally equivalent. That's a great way to put it. I can tell you that based on my findings, only 4% of those very large departments are using any kind of risk management. But that 4%, not all of them are using the rollout method. In other cases, they could use other methods. Maybe they'll just do an analysis on all of the lawsuits that have been filed and then make changes, right? But the rollout method was one that really popped out in my mind for these reasons. Just that it could be viewed as maybe a coercive, right? But when you look at it from the business standpoint, it was what they were, it's what the point of their position was, and that was to reduce the money. So to answer your question about, is there information out there? You could probably Google it and check it out, but not every place does it. And in situations where those things occur, I'm not sure how that would kind of make its way out into the media. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not something that is.
There's no like, I guess, law or anything that has these departments put out this info.
I wish.
It seems, I don't know.
But that's a really important general question, because we don't know how much money the police have cost cities in the last 10 years. We have a decent estimate. We don't know how many police officers in the last couple of years have been disciplined. We don't know how many have been fired, because there's no national warehouse for this information. The best information we have is from journalists. And some of that information is pretty chilling. In the last 5 years, you could expect anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 police officers to have lost their licenses to be police officers because they've committed felonies, including felonies such as sexually assaulting people during traffic stops. But we don't know how many times that's happened, because with any real precision, because no one's collecting that information in a regular or systematic way.
I'm actually going to have to draw this to a close. We are over time. But that's always the case where we have a really good conversation going. I want to thank both of our speakers, both Professor Archbold and Professor Powell, for contributing to this very interesting discussion. It also helps the Northern Plains Ethics Institute pursue its mission of promoting democratic participation in ethical issues affecting the Northern Plains and beyond. This is certainly beyond. You've also shown the need for additional research and commitment, because the more you do with this, I have a feeling the better off our society will be. So let's thank our speakers one more time, and thank you.
I'm glad.
Thank you.